All right, ready? Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I am your host, Franco. I'm very happy to be joined here today by journalist Vanessa Beeley, who is currently living in Damascus, Syria. She has done amazing work reporting on the war happening there, as well as exposing the white helmets. You know, a journalist is doing an amazing work when the extensions of Western powers like big tech and mainstream outlets like the BBC try to silence journalists like Vanessa Beeley. She was recently censored on YouTube. They try to take her channel down. Her channel is back though, fortunately. So we're going to talk about that here today, as well as her work on the ground in Syria. But first, Vanessa, thank you very much for being on the show. How are you?
No, I am great. Thanks for having me on.
So since this is the first time that you're here on Frank Analysis, I'd like to ask, what motivated you to do the kind of work that you do?
Oh, good question. With a lot of answers. Uh, I think the easiest answer is when you see the results of some of the neo-colonialist projects that our governments are waging against prey nations. And when you see the suffering firsthand, you can't unsee it. And so, therefore, I think, uh, I don't want to sort of take on some kind of weird mandated mantle, but I think as a human being, you simply can't turn away. You have to talk about it.
Mm. Yeah. So, about 10 days ago, YouTube sent you this message that you were not surprised by, and you called it fascist book burning, which I agree, it is fascist book burning. So I'm going to pull up that tweet real quick for everybody to see. Um, yeah, so you said, yeah, what a surprise, fascist book burning. And they said, hi, Vanessa Beeley. We have reviewed your content and found severe or repeated violations of our community guidelines. Because of this, we have removed your channel from YouTube. We know this is probably very upsetting news, but it's our job to make sure that YouTube is a safe place for all. If we think a channel severely violates our policies, we take it down to protect other users on the platform. But if you believe we've made the wrong call, you can appeal this decision. You'll find more information about the policy in question and how to submit an appeal below. So what it sounds like to me is that they were trying to make you guess like which one of your videos violated their guidelines. They weren't clear at all. It's the same kind of message that I receive. Like I've been demonetized. Ryan Christian is no longer on YouTube. His backup account got taken down. And Whitney Webb's not she doesn't have a channel on YouTube, but they're trying to go after her on Patreon. But what can you say about this?
Well, I mean, I was talking about this with a friend of mine in the UK, a historian, Marcus Papadopoulos, and I think, he has a very realistic view on it. He said, look, basically we're in their territory.
Mm,
So, if we are challenging their narratives, we're challenging their paradigms, we're challenging their campaigns and their projects, whatever those projects may be, then I guess we have to expect a level of censorship. And, James Corbett has been talking about this
yeah.
for years, actually, that this was coming, the Alexandria library burning, the book burning. I mean, that's what it is now. This is a kind of neo-McCarthyite campaign against anyone that is challenging the global health tyranny. So, if anybody is presenting, I mean, I think that was the main reason that my YouTube channel was targeted, was actually not over so much my reporting on Syria, but the fact that I was republishing, actually, scientific analysis of the COVID-19 crisis, or power grab, however you want to look at it. And of course, because it went against the WHO diktats on our health sovereignty, then those videos were removed, and I received the strikes, as they call them. Oddly, after my channel was taken down, I'd already synced everything to Library and to Odyssey, thank goodness.
I had a couple of former YouTube employees come onto my Telegram forum and asked me to send me them the details of the reasons for the strikes. Suddenly, I received an email from a kind of outreach agent of YouTube saying that they'd rescinded two of the strikes. The one that was related to COVID would remain in place. So obviously, they didn't have the power to rescind anything that goes against World Health Organization or dictatorship. But they rescinded the two strikes, I think, on two Syria videos. So I'm down to one strike.
Wow.
I mean, the whole thing is just like, it's laughable, but it's indicative of the time we're living through right now.
Yeah, it's like what Steve Poikonen from Seoul Newsday says. We're living in a cartoon. Like it's absolutely laughable, like what we're going through. And like the reasons that they give you, the lack of transparency. I mean, people are going to look back at this and think about how ridiculous these powers were to try to silence truth tellers like you.
And Whitney, I think was extraordinary. Patreon didn't go after anything that she'd published on Patreon, if I remember correctly, but they didn't like something she'd published on her own website. And with James Corbett, who had never published anything on Patreon, but again, they didn't like what he'd published elsewhere. So I mean, this kind of policing of thought by these empire truth extractors. I mean, I don't know how else to describe them, like YouTube, like Twitter, like Facebook. It's full on censorship, and they're completely blatant about it.
I don't know how much you know about Whitney, who just fled to Chile. Does it have to do with COVID at all?
What, the reason that Patreon took down her? What do you mean?
She's leaving.
Sorry,
she said she's leaving Chile.
Yeah, she's leaving Chile. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so you've been living in Syria for several years now, and you've done amazing work reporting on what is happening on the ground there. So for the audience members who are not as familiar with what is happening, could you summarize exactly what is happening in Syria over the past 12 years so people understand why the U.S. is involved? I know it's a lot, but feel free to take as much time as you want, like summarizing what's going on.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, basically the last 10 years, and actually we just passed the 10-year, I don't even like to say anniversary because that suggests a celebration, but the 10 years of misery for the Syrian people, because Syria is going through yet another regime change operation led by the US and the UK. I consider the UK to be the head of intelligence operations against Syria, and the US to be the diplomatic and military muscle in the coalition. And this war was planned decades in advance. Since Syria's independence from France in 1946, the US and the deep state in America, the CIA, have carried out a series of coups against Syria from around 1957 onwards, 1976 up to 1982. They instrumentalized the Muslim Brotherhood to try and overthrow the government of Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad. At the time that George Bush was waging the war against Iraq based on the dodgy dossier of the weapons of mass destruction, Bush and Blair were communicating about trying to create a different relationship with Syria under Bashar al-Assad. They effectively courted Assad for a number of years until they realized, of course, that the different relationship was not going to work. In 2006, Time magazine published an article called Syria in Bush's Crosshairs, where Bush was already describing the potential for arming and power multiplying insurrectionist gangs inside Syria to overthrow the government if they didn't comply with US geopolitical agendas in the region. Of course, that primarily means the security of Israel and the plundering of resources in any target nation. We then had, in 2009, Roland Dumas, the French foreign minister, told us in 2013 that in 2009 he was approached by British government officials who told him then that they were preparing to foment an uprising in Syria and to fund militia to overthrow the government. Why? Because in 2009, effectively, President Assad refused the Qatari US-backed pipeline in favor of the Russian-backed Iranian pipeline, taking Syrian resources into Europe. But he also, of course, refused to abandon his support of Palestinian resistance. And he refused to expel Hezbollah from Syrian territory. So on all counts, basically, Assad did not come into line with US policy in the region. And that is the reason that in 2011, we saw another in the series of the orchestrated Arab Springs, where weapons were poured into Syria to reinforce, again, the Muslim Brotherhood factions largely. I mean, we have to remember that the early uprisings were always on a Friday, always emanating from the Muslim Brotherhood favored mosques in a number of cities across the country. And then from basically the early days, of course, the narratives in the West were very much of the brutal regime trying to put down a peaceful uprising. In fact, the absolute opposite happened. The presidential decree in the beginning was that all security forces and police were not to carry weapons. And in fact, the largest number of casualties were among the security forces, the Syrian security forces, police, fire brigades, etc. I have testimony actually from the real Syria civil defense, the local fire brigades in the cities where the protests started. A number of them were stabbed, were shot, were sniped at, were imprisoned inside their own compounds, etc. And so then, of course, as always, the aligned media ran with the narratives that would support yet another humanitarian war against a brutal regime. That's their words, of course, not mine. And so effectively, for the last 10 years, what we've seen is the US coalition pouring money and arms into various armed groups, including ISIS, that they claim to be fighting against, but they are effectively funding and arming and equipping ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all manner of splinter groups of those two internationally designated terrorist groups. And I tend to see, having spent a lot of time on the ground inside Syria, I tend to see all of these groups as ideologically the same. The only difference is in the branding. And I look at them as mafia operations. So if you imagine these armed groups take over control of certain areas, and within those areas, they fight amongst themselves for power, for money, for equipment, for favor with the US coalition. In other words, favor means, they will receive more money, they will receive better arms, they will receive better equipment and aid, etc. The aid, the humanitarian aid that's coming into these terrorist-held areas is being taken by the terrorists themselves, and it provides them with revenue. So whenever you hear about humanitarian aid coming into Idlib, for example, it comes in through the Bab al-Hawa crossing. Bab al-Hawa is under control of Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda use the aid to provide revenue in order to maintain their militia. So, I I've tried to condense 10 years of this war into something which is maybe, I hope, understandable to people, that, it's not a civil war. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are people in this country, as there are in every country, that are against the government. There is a number of official opposition parties. But as someone told me who is against the government a long time ago, a doctor in Aleppo, he said, we all wanted reforms, we all wanted change, but we didn't want to kill the country in order to achieve them.
Yeah, that was a great interview. That's great for the people who are just learning about this, because not enough people are talking about what's happening. It's only a few channels out there that are discussing, the horrible things that have been happening over the past 10 years. And it's a really long time. But I'm hopeful that there's more voices now out there. Like there's voices like Richard Madhurst, voices like yours, and you're going around different channels to talk about what's happening, and also how they're trying to silence you. I mean, you've also done work on exposing the white helmets, which is really necessary because there's a massive propaganda about them. There's a documentary recently that won an Oscar. But so how exactly are the white helmets like a propaganda construct? Like what is that all about, and why are they being used? Like what is the exact goal here of using the white helmets?
I'll try to condense this one as well. The white helmets were created in 2013 at a point, and this is my opinion, that the media was starting to lose control of the narrative. It was starting to become apparent that they were effectively lying, both directly and by omission. They were reliant heavily upon very dodgy citizen journalists that were rapidly being exposed as frauds, like Danny Abdul Dayem. I don't know if you remember back to the fact that he pre-recorded a report for CNN, which was exposed to actually be completely fake. And I remember Anderson Cooper trying to dig himself out of that hole. So at this point, I believe they needed to create an organization which would provide plausible deniability for the media. In other words, if the white helmets were caught fabricating evidence or fabricating narratives, then the media could just say, yeah, it's not us, it's the white helmets, right? So I think this is the reason they were created, one of the reasons. And we also have to remember that there was a recent leak of UK Foreign Office documents that demonstrated the extent to which the UK Foreign Office and intelligence agencies were effectively providing media and PR and support, political diplomatic support, including producing fabricated narratives in order to support the democratic rebel narrative and to whitewash the various armed groups that were committing atrocities against the Syrian civilians. And the white helmets were produced in 2013, not inside Syria, in Turkey and Jordan. They were manufactured by a former military intelligence operative, James Lemazurier, who had a history of working for NATO member states in various interventionist campaigns, such as, for example, former Yugoslavia and Iraq. And they effectively were embedded then with the armed groups, or as they're called euphemistically by the West, the rebels inside Syria. Now, these armed groups are dominated by Al-Qaeda in almost every instance, or Al-Qaeda affiliates. So the white helmets are effectively embedded exclusively with areas that are controlled by Al-Qaeda or their affiliates, including ISIS. The white helmets were tasked with documenting war crimes. However, the fact that they are embedded with terrorist organizations, and yet there has never been a single report from the white helmets on any war crimes committed by those armed groups, gives an indication of their bias and the bias that they are paid to have. Because despite claiming to be a neutral, non-governmental organization, they are funded by the majority of the governments that have a declared interest in the removal of the Syrian government and the partitioning of Syria, the destabilization of Syria, and the imposition of a Muslim Brotherhood Islamist regime on the people of Syria. The group itself is sectarian. It's not inclusive of any other minority sects inside Syria, which include Shia Muslim, Christian, Druze, etc. Now, this is a very important fact. It may not seem to be that important, but Syria effectively for 10 years has been fighting to defend its secular society. It's a pluralist society. It includes every single possible religious minority and ethnicity in this country, and everybody lives together. Any other organization that is Syrian, that is really Syrian, will be inclusive. The White Helmets is sectarian. It consists only of radical Sunni Islam Muslim Brotherhood factions. And it has expressed sectarian views. That has even been picked up by mainstream media and has been mentioned by James Le Mesurier, their founder, who died mysteriously in November 2019, having been accused of embezzling funds, millions that were coming in to finance the White Helmet construct inside Syria. They have been filmed participating in executions, in the beating up of prisoners. They've been filmed calling for the extermination of Shia Muslim villages in Idlib. They have been accused of organ trafficking by Syrian civilians. They've been accused of running child abduction operations. They've been accused of desecrating Christian churches and monuments, particularly in Idlib, of theft, of thuggery, of criminality. But probably the most detrimental role they've played in the destabilization of Syria is the production of the chemical weapon narratives. And of course, in Duma 2018, which led to the UK, French, and US bombing of Damascus. I was actually here when that attack took place. It has been now shown by whistleblowers from within the OPCW, actually high-level inspectors, who have shown that the OPCW report was doctored in order to retrospectively justify the US-led unlawful aggression against Syria, and that the staged scenes in the hospital in Douma were produced by the White Helmets in collaboration with Jaish al-Islam, the armed group that was in control of Douma at the time. And the previous chemical attacks in Khan Sheikhoun and even in Ghouta, the White Helmets are again involved in the production of those events, which of course have effectively maintained the war against Syria. So in my view, the White Helmets, their primary role is to provide this humanitarian cover for the armed groups. They move consistently with Al-Qaeda. So when areas liberated and Al-Qaeda are allowed to leave to go to Idlib, the White Helmets don't stay behind to take care of the civilians they claim to have been protecting during their occupation by the armed groups. They leave with the extremist armed groups to Idlib, where they set up camp, again, providing this kind of humanitarian whitewashing, this cover for these armed groups. So they move with the armed groups to the new front lines every time.
Yeah. So all of that work that you reported on, you should have been praised for that. But instead, you were hunted down by BBC, and they tried to smear you, as well as Eva Barlat. You guys received threatening emails. I believe it was like at the end of 2020 last year, correct?
Yeah.
So what exactly happened there?
Well, basically, this was after the death of James Le Mesurier. The official opinion is that he committed suicide. And of course, at the time, they tried to pin the blame for his suicide on those who had been outing him as a former military intelligence officer, as someone that had clearly been tasked with creating the white helmets and providing the propaganda that maintained the war against Syria. It's also worth pointing out that his widow, Emma Winberg, or Emma Lemazurier, as she now is, was co-founder of an organization called Incostrat. Incostrat was also funded by the UK Foreign Office to provide the PR and media support for armed groups such as Jaish al-Islam. Now, Jaish al-Islam in 2013 invaded an area to the north of Damascus, Adra, with Nusra Front. They massacred Shia and Alawite Muslim civilians at this time. They burned civilians inside bakery furnaces. They burned them alive. They decapitated others. They tortured others, and they kidnapped thousands and took them to Douma, where they were kept in the Tauba jail inside Douma until its liberation in 2018. So this is to give you an indication. This is a husband and wife team that were effectively being funded to whitewash the war crimes being committed by armed groups inside Syria, armed groups that were, of course, being promoted, funded, armed, and equipped by the US coalition, which included the UK. So it's, as far as I'm concerned, Missouri was part of a much larger cluster of outreach agents that were tasked with effectively creating the propaganda that would damage and criminalize the Syrian government and its allies. So in November 2020, the BBC they actually contacted me in July 2020, I think. And prior to that, there'd been an episode from PBS also where they tried to kind of pin Missouri's suicide on my perceived attacks against his good name. And the BBC then basically went down very much the same route. They wanted to try and portray me as this falsifying creature that had pushed him, to commit suicide. Nothing to do with, of course, the fact that the group he was managing and funding and had created were being accused by Syrian civilians of, as I mentioned, organ trafficking. This is not an accusation that came from me. It came from Syrian civilians living under the occupation of the White Helmets, right? And that has been extensively documented by Maxim Grigoriev from the Study for Democracy. It was presented at a panel at the UN Security Council in which I participated. So, and then you had the revelations from the whistleblowers within the OPCW. So effectively, this entire construct was unraveling. And Missouri was then also being accused of fraud and embezzling the funds from Mayday Rescue, the NGO that he established, in order to funnel the money from the British government and other governments to the White Helmets. So the BBC effectively, I don't see them as anything more than an extension of British intelligence agencies themselves, because this entire series, Mayday series, which I think was 15 episodes, effectively simply attacking those who were exposing the British Foreign Office involvement in the intelligence operations against Syria, including the White Helmets, but also to try and rebuild the narrative. And that's very much what we're seeing now, is this kind of history revisionism, this attempt to take us back to the narratives that started this war and to wipe out all the investigation that journalists like myself had done for the last 10 years. It's extraordinary. I feel like I'm in a time warp at the moment.
Yeah, this is a common pattern that we're seeing, is either they demonize the messengers, they demonize the people that are trying to inform the public about the truth, instead of going after the people that are causing the harm to other people.
Exactly.
That's what's happening to Julian Assange. It's what's happening to yourself with how they're demonizing you. They're acting as if you have all this power to cause destruction, to cause people to kill themselves. what is that, right?
I mean, the extraordinary thing is that they behave like tyrants and thugs and bullies. You're not allowed to question, you're not allowed to challenge, you're not allowed to confront. And then somehow they become the victim because you are challenging and you are confronting. Why? Because their lies, their operations are leading to the deaths of Syrian people. I can't put it any more simply. The sanctions that are being imposed on the back of the lies they have created are killing Syrian people. We're without electricity, we're without fuel. People are queuing between 15 and 24 hours just to be able to fill their cars up. There's no bread because the US is stealing and in last summer was burning all of the wheat crops and barley crops inside Syria, all of the cotton plantations, the olive plantations. The terrorists are occupying the biggest majority of the olive and pistachio plantations are occupied by the US proxies, by the terrorist groups on the ground here. The wheat and the grain is being stolen by the US occupation forces and their proxies and is being sold outside Syria. So in other words, simply to deprive the Syrian people of their resources. The oil is occupied by the US, not because the US needs it. It provides revenue for its proxy forces like the SDF or even ISIS. But they want to deprive the Syrian people of the oil, which means we don't have heating, we don't have electricity. As I said, we don't have fuel, we don't have gas, we don't have all of the things that the majority of people in the West take for granted. We don't have, because US forces are occupying Syrian resources and are preventing the Syrian people from receiving them. This is a war crime in itself, right? And on top of that, they're imposing economic sanctions, which are, I can't even describe how people live here. The cost of food is rocketing. People don't have the money to be able to pay for it because inflation is going sky high. When I started coming, it was around 500 Syrian pounds to $1. Now it's almost 5,000.
Wow. One thing that I really need to inform myself more on, and I'm glad that I have you here on today to discuss this more, is what's happening with the Kurds and Rojava. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct. It's Rojava, right?
Yeah.
So what?
I mean, Rojava. Look, Rojava is the Kurds, and I think the greatest disservice you can do to the Kurds is to call them the Kurds, because actually there's a large number of factions within the Kurds themselves.
Okay.
You have Shia Kurds, you have Sunni Kurds, you have in Turkey and in Iraq and in Iran and in Syria. They're not a sort of homogenous collection of people. There are different sectors within that Kurd umbrella, let's say. But the Kurds are a tiny, tiny minority inside Syria. And in the northeast or in the north, they're a tiny percentage of the Syrian population, but they have been welcomed into Syria. However, among those Kurdish communities, not all are looking for separatism or for an autonomous region. Rojava is the name that the Kurdish separatists gave to an area in the north of Syria. It doesn't exist in Syria. It only exists in Western propaganda. Because, of course, I think it was John Kerry that said, well, if we can't succeed in overthrowing the Syrian government, we can go to Plan B. And, of course, Plan B, as it has been throughout history of US neocolonialism, is partitioning. And one of the ideas for creating an autonomous region is the region in the northeast to be settled on, effectively ethnically cleansed of all Assyrians and Syrian Arabs in order to allow the Kurdish separatists, and I keep emphasizing the separatists, because the SDF, which is predominantly PKK, right, the Kurdish separatists. Now, let's just cast our mind back to 1999, when the CIA was actually involved in the capture of Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of PKK in Turkey. And when America was actually imposing sanctions on Syria because they claimed they were harboring the PKK. So back in the early 2000s, the PKK was a terrorist organization, according to the US, right? I'm laughing because this just yet again demonstrates the sheer hypocrisy of US foreign policy, right? An enemy is an enemy when it's a pain in the neck to US policy. An enemy becomes a friend when it's useful to US policy, okay? And so now what we're seeing is the weaponization of the PKK in the Northeast to ethnically cleanse the Northeast of Syrian nationals, whether they're Assyrians, whether they're Syrian Arabs, etc., Christians, in order to occupy that territory with Kurdish Contras, right? The whole Kurdish independence is another, I actually liken it to the occupation of Palestine by Israel. It's the same propaganda. You know, a people without a land, blah, blah, blah. They had a land. They were living perfectly happy inside Syrian territory, right? If they had any loyalty to the Syrian government that gave them that territory and allowed them to live, then they would be protecting Syrian territorial integrity, right? Part of the kind of myth about the Kurds is that the Syrian Arab army abandoned them to be attacked by ISIS. This was actually completely untrue. The Syrian government did a deal with the Kurds saying they would stay and protect the Northeast against terrorist attacks, because at that point, Syria was being invaded from all sides by armed factions. And the Syrian Arab army was spread thin, defending a huge number of front lines. And at that point, Russia hadn't intervened militarily. Russia didn't come in until September 2015, right? But for the Kurds, they saw it as an opportunity, right? And then, of course, with the backing of the US and Israel, because Israel is behind any kind of Kurdish settlement or Kurdish separatism, particularly in Iraq, but also in Syria. Because if we remember with the Yinon plan, the Israeli Yinon plan, then the territory to the east of the Euphrates, they perceived to be Israeli territory eventually. And so for them, the Kurds are a convenient settlement tool to take that territory from inside Syria, right? And that's effectively what's happening. The schools now in that area are running Kurdish education programs, right? The Syrian Arab curriculum is no longer part of the education programs there. So this is a hostile takeover of Syrian territory by Kurdish separatists. And there are Kurds within Syria that are loyal to the territorial integrity of Syria. So it's a complex question, but in my view, this is a balkanization plan by the US, and the Kurds are being weaponized. We know they are, because the minute that Trump threatened to withdraw troops, they started to flip-flop back towards Damascus. I mean, I went to the Northeast. I actually went to a US base that had been vacated close to Manbij in the Northeast. We were trying to go there all morning, and the Kurdish factions were refusing to give us permission to go, right? A Syrian Arab army commander actually came up to me. He said, "Come on, we'll go. I don't care about the Kurds. We'll go. This is Syrian territory. We'll take you. But you only have about 10 minutes to actually have a look around the base, because the Kurds will come and they will want to kick you out." I mean, can you imagine? This is Syrian territory. Right. It's a US illegal military base, and we're being told we can't go there by the Kurdish separatists that were being power multiplied by the US, right? So we entered the base. The Kurds apparently had taken all the equipment, all of the logistical equipment, etc. We were taking photos. We were looking at everything that was still there, some of the books, some of the paperwork, etc. All of a sudden, the Kurds arrived. We had to leave. Immediately after we left, they burned everything. So where did the instruction come from that they should burn everything in the US base so that we can't see what was there? We'd already taken what we needed to. We had information on American servicemen. We had information on the operations there, etc. But who gave them the instructions to go there and to burn all the remaining evidence? Right. So, that just gives you an insight into how complex this is. When America appeared to withdraw support, the Kurds started to negotiate with Damascus, which is what they should have done in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. But the minute that Biden came in and it was perceived that he would re-energize the autonomous region project and he would re-energize support for the Kurds, they flipped back to the US and away from Damascus. So, throughout history, this is what the Kurds have done. Wow.
Yeah. So the final question here before you head out, because you did mention you did mention some things about COVID earlier, and I've noticed that the channels that YouTube went after first were channels that were challenging the mainstream media narrative about COVID, which were people like Derek Bros of the Conscious Resistance, Ryan Christian of the Last American Vagabond. I've been outspoken here on this channel about how we need to challenge the mainstream media narrative. We need to always question what they're saying about this, because they're trying to take advantage of the situation. So I'm curious to hear, what are the policies like in Syria right now with COVID, and how can some of these policies, like for example, kids wearing masks during school, like some of these children are going to school for the first time, they're still developing. How can this have a psychological effect on these kids who are growing up during these COVID restrictions?
In Syria, in the beginning, we had a curfew at night. I think schools were closed. They took reasonable measures. But, this is a country that's been at war or had a war foisted upon it for 10 years. It's living under sanctions. It's living under the occupation of its resources. It has a lot of other things to worry about other than Corona. And people are literally working during the day in order to feed their families at night, like taxi drivers, for example. So I can't remember exactly when it was, but the president made the decision and he made a public announcement that the lockdown was going to be more devastating than the virus. So while they would continue to take the precautions necessary, the curfew would be lifted and people could basically return within reason to pretty much normal life. And that's, to be honest, what we've seen. There is none of the, let's say, hysteria here. No. Some people wear masks, but for example, if I walk into a shop and someone's wearing a mask, I don't get yelled at for not wearing a mask.
Here you do.
Yeah, I know. And I think pretty much everywhere,
well. Yeah, but at large, for example, in the US, this could have psychological impacts on children.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, the schools, I'm not sure if it's an actual rule that kids wear masks, but the majority of kids that I see in the schools around me here are not wearing masks, the majority. As I say, the government and the health ministry have taken all the precautions necessary, whatever this virus is. I certainly don't think it's a global pandemic, but there are viruses every year. And our very health system dictates that those viruses are going to mutate and perhaps become more virulent year on year because of the whole vaccine program, etc. Of course, we don't have the vaccine here yet, thank heavens. Well, that's another whole subject. But, you know, people here have an awful lot more to worry about than what I call the Al-Qaeda of viruses. You know what I mean? Honestly, without the media, we wouldn't have any hysteria about COVID-19 or whatever COVID-19 is. But here, and as I say, I'm not belittling the efforts that the health ministry has taken to combat all of the, you know, the medical issues here in this country, because this is a heavily immune system suppressed country because of the conditions that people are living under here. So, of course, you know, any illness, the same in Yemen. I mean, let's not forget that in October 2020, Yemen declared herd immunity against corona. You know, but look at what else they're dealing with. They're dealing with starvation. They're dealing with their entire infrastructure destroyed. They're dealing with typhoid, cholera.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, that's the thing. People here take it more in their stride because they've already gone through so much.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, especially Yemen right now. What they're dealing with cholera, the sanctions, which is the people there, like their conditions are being exacerbated. I think it's thanks to people like you, truth tellers like you, Vanessa Beeley, that people are becoming more informed about what's happening. And hopefully that will lead to more resistance, more public pressure to finally end these wars, these sanctions that are causing more and more human destruction. Vanessa Beeley, thank you for very much for being on here today. It was a pleasure to have you on. Is there any final message you would like to leave the audience with?
I think only on what you mentioned about sanctions. I think if people really want to look, regardless of your opinion of the conflict itself, sanctions are never designed to do anything other than collectively punish the people of a target nation. The sanctions have been in place for 10 years and have been incrementally increasing in their sadism and their punishment of the Syrian people. They are not effective. They have not achieved the goals that the US, the UK, and the EU intended them to achieve. All they've achieved is further murder of Syrian people, and I can't put it any less strongly than that. As they do in Yemen, as they did in Iraq, 500,000 children killed by sanctions alone. And those sanctions, of course, cannot be imposed, not in the case of Syria, but in Iraq and in Yemen, without the help of the UN, which is nothing more than an extension of US-UK power. Please, if people want to do anything positive for this country, please campaign to have sanctions lifted. That's the most, you know, without sanctions, this country can restore itself. It can heal. It can move forward. With the sanctions, it can't. It will just stay in this stagnant pool of misery. So sanctions, get them lifted.
You can find Vanessa Beeley on YouTube. She still has her channel. Who knows how long she will stay on, though, as well as like some of these other channels, like as mine as well. I do have a backup channel. You can also find Vanessa Beeley on Brockfin. She's also frequently on channels like Slow News Day, The Last American Vagabond, and Unlimited Hangout, which you can all find on Rockfin. Is there anywhere else where people can find you, Vanessa?
I still have a Patreon account kind of intact at the moment. I'm not sure for how much longer. Subscribe Star I just got onto. Actually, I'm on Linktree. If people go to my name on Linktree, they'll find all of the platforms that I'm on.
All right. Vanessa, thanks again for coming on, and to everybody else, stay informed.